One of the weirdest debates that's going on right now in the realm of comic books is all oriented around the character of Miles Morales. Specifically, a question about him. Is Miles Morales actually Spider-Man? Oh, goodness, this is a weird one. You see, like most debates on the internet these days, people on both sides of it are constantly talking past one another because I guess in modern society, the ability to communicate takes a lower place on priority lists than hentai and shitty memes. Even lower on the list is knowing what the definition of words are, and we'll get to that too. Look, my point is just that I think the debate around this character is stupid, and I think it's actually missing some bigger problems that are really oriented around the character that haven't been fixed in 10 years. However, I will have to admit that when it comes to the dumb in this level, with both sides of the discussion, one of them is way dumber than the other. One side is admittedly getting tied up over semantics. Again, going into the communication issues, the inability to communicate ideas, or really get across what your real concerns are, which a lot of people have that problem, and not knowing what words mean. And then the other side just honestly has the worst problems. They have the same problems as Group A, but on top of that, they've got problems with having any grasp on comic book history, how long it takes to establish a character, what makes up the concept of popularity, what makes a good story, and how making fanboy excuses for all of that just makes you look like a moron, rather than convincing anyone that your favorite character is worth getting to know. So, let's talk about what exactly is going on here and break down why both elements are so silly, and get down to the real problem of one of the Spider-Men in Miles Morales. Okay, to answer this first question, is Miles Morales Spider-Man? Yes, he is a Spider-Man. One of several. A lot of people have held the mantle of Spider-Man. For example, Peter Parker's clone, Ben Reilly, actually held the mantle of Spider-Man at one point after he was originally introduced in the very first Clone Saga, which, believe it or not, for those who don't know, there is actually two of them. And then on top of that, he took the mantle up again later on, during the 90s, and actually had a dope-as-hell costume, too. Then, of course, you have the Spider-Man of the year 2099, Miguel O'Hara. Then there's Spider-Man 2211, and I'm not going to talk too much about him. He looks so fucking stupid. But anyway, it's not dissimilar to how there's been multiple people who have held the mantle of Iron Man, Batman, Superman, etc. I feel like getting mad over the idea that Miles is being called Spider-Man is a little silly. There are people out there who just lose their minds over it when it comes to Peter and Miles calling each other by the same code name, essentially, in the most recent video game. Let's tone down the screeching for 5 seconds, shall we? Just think about it. Imagine if you're just some dude from the street and you see a guy in a costume covered in webs, shooting webbing from his hands. If you say, "Hey, Spider-Man," it's honestly easier than having a bunch of different code names and stuff, because unlike Batman and Robin, Miles and Peter have very similar costumes and powers. It's actually kind of difficult at a glance to tell if the two of them are different people, or if it's one guy with a different costume, or yada yada yada. Now that could go into the unoriginality of Miles as a character, etc, etc. That's a whole nother thing. We'll get to that later. My point being is that I don't think it's a problem. I also don't think that it demeans or does anything to diminish the character of Peter Parker either. I think that that's a silly argument. No offense. Because we've got characters that go by the same superhero name in other worlds. I mean, look at the Green Lanterns. It doesn't demean Hal Jordan for Jon Stewart or Guy Gardner to be called Green Lantern. Now, admittedly, I think Kyle Rayner is a different story, but I think that's just because Kyle Rayner sucks, but again, that's a whole nother rant. Also, before you scream at me that the Lanterns are a police force, yada yada yada, you could easily do a Spider-Man organization comic and have Peter, Miles, Eddie Brock as Venom, Ben Reilly, and Kane teaming up in a book called Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, where everybody picks a borough and patrols it, And it's the same thing. All you're really doing is trying to find distinctions, but there's really no difference between the situations. It's two people with similar abilities using the same code name. It's not something that hasn't been done before, is my point. Now, before you start screeching at me about this little disagreement that I have with you, listen to what I have to say next. If Miles got a different code name like Ben Reilly did with the Scarlet Spider, or Kane did with, well, just Kane, I really wouldn't be against it. But I also don't see it happening, unless some people at Marvel give up on trying to force the character down everyone's throat and just let him be his own thing. Speaking of which... Alright, let's take the other side of the argument. The people that are freaking out and act like Miles Morales is destined to be Peter Parker's replacement, that Peter Parker's on the way out, he's not actually that popular, yada yada yada. No, you can't replace Peter Parker. When it comes to Spider-Man, the first person that everybody's going to think of is always going to be Peter Parker. Always. And why is that? Well, I can boil it down to 3 easy reasons. Number 1, he's the original. Simple enough, right? Number 2, he's been around for 61 years. And number 3, he is the 3rd most popular comic book character ever, only surpassed by Superman and Batman. Peter Parker, as a character, is a titan in the world of comic books. That character has sold over 385 million comics throughout his years of publication. The character has had several films, with 3 noteworthy actors playing him, and he's been dynamite at the box office every time he has a movie. The lowest grossing film based around Spider-Man since the films with Tobey Maguire was Amazing Spider-Man 2. And even then, it made $709 million at the box office. At the character's height of popularity in film, he's cracked $1 billion twice. Hell, he almost got $2 billion with No Way Home. And I still maintain that if they were to ever do a crossover film with Tom Holland's Spider-Man and Tom Hardy's Venom, that film is going to crack $2 billion, given how beloved both characters are, how beloved both actors are, and how legendary the Spider-Man-Venom rivalry is. On top of both comics and film, you've also got animation. Peter Parker has had TV series based around him, both in live action and animation, since his inception. Then there's a myriad of video games that he's had based on him as well, many of which have sold millions of copies. In fact, we actually have a direct comparison in the realm of video games between both characters, like we do in film. Though it is impressive that Miles' standalone game ended up selling around 6 million copies throughout the course of a couple of years, Peter Parker's game sold 33 million units in a similar time frame. Are the numbers starting to spell disaster at sacrifice for you yet?
Fat asses!
Peter Parker as a character is a cultural icon. If you think that a character that's only been around for a little over a decade is going to supplant him, you've got another thing coming. This is where the frustration comes from longtime Spider-Man fans like myself. Miles Morales just isn't on Peter's level. And what gets annoying is that there's no shame in that. You can't supplant an icon overnight, because the accomplishments of that icon aren't going anywhere. Characters have to be able to build their own legacies, and that's going to take time. Not to mention, Miles' accomplishments as a character thus far, at least in regards to media, are nothing to sneeze at. The fact that he was able to crack even 100 million at the box office, being as, well, not well known as he is impressive. What's even more impressive is his second film came close to 700 million at the box office. That's pretty cool. He actually outdid Venom's second film, though admittedly, at least in my opinion, Let There Be Carnage wasn't nearly as good as the original. I digress, though. He is able to pull in numbers for a character that isn't really well known, really shouldn't be able to do. But he does. That's really impressive given how short of a time he's been around. Now, does he sell as much in comics as Peter does? No. But, again, for a character that's only over a decade old, every bit of numbers he's gotten, which on average is around 50,000 a month, shipped across the United States, that's respectable. There are characters that have been around for as long as Spider-Man has that actually don't get sales numbers like that. So the fact that Miles is able to do it is impressive. He does have a small following compared to Peter Parker. Not to mention, there has been growth, as I mentioned, in his box office presence. Though, admittedly, I personally hated the first film and have zero desire to watch the second. I'll get to that later, too. My overall point is that in no context is Miles within spitting distance of being as much of an icon as his predecessor. And that's not really something you can force feed down people's throats or just lie to them about. The numbers don't lie. I have no problem with Miles Morales being referred to as Spider-Man in-universe in the same way that I don't care if Jon Stewart and Hal Jordan are called Green Lantern at the same time. I already made that parallel, but I feel like I need to reiterate it. The thing is, I'm convinced that there's folks out there that want Peter Parker to disappear and Miles to take his place. Sort of like when they got rid of Hal Jordan to have Kyle Rayner. The problem is that would be a massive disaster. And that brings us to the third part of this video. Back when Miles Morales was created by a white writer named Brian Michael Bendis and a white artist named Sarah Pichelli, their editor, Axel Alonzo, who would later go on to be Marvel's worst editor-in-chief in the last 30 years, let it slip that the reason that Miles Morales was created to replace the Ultimates version of Peter Parker was purely because Barack Obama was elected president and Obama's biracial. Now, Axel Alonzo is deserving of a bit of a rant, because this guy was really bad at his job and had really stupid priorities. Most of his famous decisions during his time as an editor at Marvel were 100% racially motivated. Overseeing the creation of the all-new, all-different line when he was the editor-in-chief, where they race and gender swapped several characters. And during that time, Marvel's sales tanked hard, and they've never recovered from it. On top of that, Alonzo had a history of calling Marvel Comics fans racists, tracing back to the Captain America series, Red, White, and Black, which rewrote the history of the super soldier serum to tie into the Tuskegee experiments. Some people accused that series of race baiting, and Alonzo, of course, called people racists, which just shows that he can't take criticism. He's also the one who greenlit turning Captain America into a Nazi. It's no wonder why this guy was just fired, because he really had no ideas outside of his progressive politics. He was a creatively bankrupt individual, and he set Marvel Comics down a path that, as I mentioned, they haven't been able to recover from as an institution, and he crippled Miles Morales as a character out of the gate. Which is why I brought all that up. The entire motivation behind the character of Miles Morales being created was 100% political. Even though he didn't go out of his way to hire a black writer or a black artist to create the character. He just had white people do it. Now, does it really matter that Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli are white? Not really. It just shows that Axel Alonzo will just have anybody do race baiting stuff so that he can get head pats. He doesn't really care that much about diversity or anything along those lines. He cares about his own ego and looking good politically. This is generally the problem with Miles Morales. People are fucking petrified to have this character go through the same amount of suffering and struggle that Peter Parker has gone through. In the comic books, the only interesting story that Miles had is his origin story. And even then, a lot of it is just retreading the same path that Peter Parker went down, including the speech that Norman Osborn gives in Ultimate Spider-Man #1. The last bit of suffering he had as a character was when his mother was killed in Ultimate Comics Spider-Man #22. And by the way, that issue came out 10 years ago. From what I've been told, the whole plot of his second movie is basically making Spider-Man 2099 into an asshole to mock the idea that characters should go through tragedy to develop. Okay, buddy. Tell me you're a shitty writer without telling me you're a shitty writer, alright? Or at least tell me you've never written a serious story in your life without telling me you've actually never written a serious story in your life. Which, by the way, the people who have written the Miles Morales movies have almost completely written comedies. It's no wonder that they have no fucking clue what they're doing here. Now, I'm saying that without having seen the film. But if that is the plot, if what people are telling me is true, then these guys have basically spit in the face of Stan Lee with that one, because that was Stan Lee's philosophy when it came to writing. Hell, you spit in the face of every creator ever and honestly expose the fact that people are fucking petrified of having Miles Morales struggle as a character, and that the writers of those movies are goddamn cowards. Now, why am I saying all of this? Why do I think that this is the case, that people are fucking petrified to have this character go through something interesting? Well, it all goes back to Miles' origin. Because Miles was conceptualized to attempt to cram down cultural change and to get mainstream head pats from places like CNN, NPR, and so on and so forth by Axel Alonzo, Miles by nature is restricted to being a political character, and it sucks. I mean, if you look at Miles' biggest supporters, and I hope you can hear the air quotes there, a lot of them haven't read the comics. They couldn't tell you much about him outside of the movies, which they probably pirated. Here's the thing when it comes to black characters in Marvel Comics. You can put any of them through hell. T'Challa, War Machine, Photon, Luke Cage, Bishop, etc. They've all gone through crazy suffering. Now, nobody's going to complain, because comic book fans like these characters. These characters have been around for a while. They're characters that have struggled and suffered, and as an audience that cares about this, we have struggled with them, in a sense. We feel like we've grown with these characters, and thus we're attached to them. It's hard to really feel that with Miles. Miles is different. In an age of social media, if you were to have something happen that's a parallel to any of the suffering that Peter Parker had in his life, the writer of that comic would immediately be called a racist. Suddenly there would be articles in the New York Times, in NPR, in the Washington Post, and on top of that, any garbage rag like the Mary Sue or CBR would be calling for the writer to be fired. This is the future that Axel Alonzo chose for this character, because he cared more about political brownie points than creating something interesting. This is why you see so many independent creators tell people that you can't let politics take over your art. Because if you do, you have characters get completely kneecapped, because they'll never be able to get out of the blocks. They can never have an opposing idea. They can never really go anywhere outside of the bounds that have been created by politics. Politics by its nature is not creative, folks. It puts you in a box. You're only allowed to think a certain way within the tribe, and if you don't, you have betrayed the tribe. It is not something you want to do. If you do it, your character has been doomed to be nothing more than the great value version of Peter Parker. Now, there is hope for Miles. See, there's a version of this character that I like a lot, and that's the video game version in the newer titles. Video game Miles in the PS4, PS5 games is pretty good. He doesn't feel like a diet soda version of Peter. He's obviously not as smart. Not even close. His interests are different. He's a nerd, but not in the same way. He's a music nerd. But he's also not your stereotypical black kid. He couldn't quote you lyrics from Wu-Tang Clan. He doesn't know that Wu-Tang is for the children, like someone like I do, because I'm old and listen to old hip-hop. However, if you were to talk to Miles about Daft Punk, he would probably talk your ear off, because that's what he's into. The character also has a ton of humility to him, alongside an eagerness to learn and understanding that he's just a kid in a lot of ways. The games are doing something that I honestly think is really smart. They let him be mentored by Peter and make sure to give them traits as characters that complement one another. I'm of the opinion that this is the best version of Miles. And that's largely because Miles in the video games is rebooting the comic book character in a place where, honestly, there's been enough time that's passed where you can recreate him absolutely devoid of the political context in which he was originally brought in, and that political context that was forced upon him by that idiot Axel Alonzo. He doesn't have the trappings, thank God. Now, granted, there are still going to be people that are scared to have him suffer, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, you know what? Let's have that minute be right now. Now, I'm something of a comic book writer myself, so how, pray tell, would I fix Miles Morales? Well, let me go into detail. So this is going to be more of an ad-libbed section instead of really me scripting things out. How would I fix Miles Morales? To be honest with you, the first thing that I would do is I would walk into the room if I was working at Marvel Comics and tell editorial, look, the way that we're going with this character is stupid. We need to start discerning him from Peter immediately. He doesn't need to be as sarcastic. We can make him more unsure of himself. We can humble him a bit. We can make him a little bit more different. And on top of that, we need to get everybody who thinks that this character's only trait is, well, this.
I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all.
And get them far and far away from this fucking character. No more Adidas. No more of his fro sticking out the top of his fucking mask. None of that. This character is more than his skin color. Fuck off. That would be the first thing I would do, and given how Marvel is right now, they would throw me out. But that's the first thing that I would do, because I don't want this character to be Black Spider-Man. I want him to be a Spider-Man that feels different. In this particular case, I want him to be a little bit more childlike. I want him to be a little bit more innocent. I want him to be, in some ways, a bit of a tabula rasa, because he, again, as I mentioned up to this point, hasn't experienced much. So let's start getting him into the dirty parts of these stories. One thing I noticed when I went back and read Absolute Carnage was Donny Cates kept Miles away from the grittier parts of that story. Kept him far away from it. I think it's time that we have Miles track a serial killer. Yeah, that's right. My first arc, Miles versus Carnage. Peter's not around to help. Venom's not around to help. Nobody else is around to help. Miles has to deal with a serial killer. And do you want to know how I would start it? I would kill one of his loved ones. And not only would I kill him, I would kill him like John DeWolf got killed. Just bluntly, right out of the gate. Just bam, dead. Why? Because he needs to suffer. He needs to have something happen that challenges his worldview, that makes him look at the world differently. Because at the end of the day, that is how humans grow. And that's how characters grow in fiction. They suffer, they go through hardship, and they overcome. Will some people be mad on Twitter at me killing a character that is non-white? Probably, and they might call me a racist. You can remind them of the fact that I'm a Jew, and they might fuck off, or they might do the whole from the river to the sea thing and, threaten to decapitate my children. Good thing is, I don't have any children. Regardless, where I would be putting myself right out of the gate is in a position to tell a mature story that takes Miles down a tough road. Carnage is a character that, honestly, is kind of tough to really grasp for a child, for a teenager, because he's a serial killer. His whole worldview is based around killing. And honestly, one of my biggest inspirations, if I were to do a story like that, would be the one-shot known as Carnage Mind Bomb, which is written by Warren Ellis. It's one of my favorite comics ever. And I would go into that. I would have situations where Miles is getting completely freaking spanked by Cletus, and Cletus is just drilling him with his worldview, which for those of you who have read Mind Bomb, you know as well as I do, is freaking twisted. He's going into that, and he's trying to break Miles. He's holding the death of a loved one over his head, etc., etc. He just keeps going and going and going. And then Miles overcomes. he wins. Or he does something long enough to get to a point where some sort of backup can come help him. Maybe Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four or something like that. But he struggles and he endures and he gets through it. The other thing I would start doing is I would try to give him his own rogues gallery. I'd try to create a few new characters and also create new versions of older characters to kind of mix up the rogues gallery so that we can separate them out. Because Peter's got enough. You know, we can take a couple and have Miles encounter them more often. One thing I would do, I would try to make a hobgoblin that is tied to Miles. Or maybe someone dies and blames Spider-Man for it, and they get turned into a new Demo Goblin. Things along those lines are stuff that I would do. But I would also want to create other characters that are brand new, that aren't really around, you know, Miles and haven't been encountered by Peter, but still have like a, you know, a tie to Miles somehow, because the personal element makes it so much more engrossing, in my opinion. So you could have there be like a music producer that Miles is working with that, you know, like some producers do, they have dealings with shady individuals. One of those shady individuals does something to him that mutates him, and he has to do crazy things. Miles has to try to stop him, but he knows who this guy is, so he doesn't want to hurt him. Immediately, again, you've got that conflict. So that, in my opinion, is something that would really work. Now, for the video game version of Miles, y'all know that deaf girl that's kind of annoying in his story, the one that honestly nobody likes. Yeah, I'm gonna Gwen Stacy the fuck out of her. I'm gonna kill that bitch. Oh god, that's gonna get taken out of context. But no, in all seriousness, I'm gonna Gwen Stacy the hell out of her. And here's the reason why. I'm very much of the opinion that we could be in a situation with the video games where Miles is probably going to be able to sell enough copies in the interim to, you know, make their money back. Because he did that with his own game, right? The problem that you're going to run into is that he's not going to make Peter Parker numbers. And part of that is, again, he's just not that well established. So what you do to establish him is similar things. You let him go through suffering. What made him so relatable in the games? You go along his journey with him. Because Peter's trying to help him, because Peter is a good person. And you see Miles doing heroic and cool things and wanting to help before he even had powers. And that makes him relatable. That honestly made him feel like one of the kids that you just kind of like meet at church or something. Where he's gung-ho, he really wants to do the right thing. He's not sure how to do it, but he really wants to be there, and he cannot stand to see people suffer. He's just got a huge heart. And I really feel that like that heart is what really needs to be emphasized. Peter Parker is a brainy character. Miles has heart. That's the distinction that I would start going with the two of them. You know, Miles has other people to be the brains for him. You know, Peter doesn't need that. Miles does, you know, because it's just not in him. But what he's got is a big heart for people. And he cares about people. And he cares about New York. And he cares about New Yorkers. And he cares about all these things. Like, that heart, that love could be central to the character. And you really could do a lot of things where, honestly, you do the corny love conquers all, but make it pretty cool, to be honest with you. Yeah, is it hokey sounding the way I put it? It is. But there's ways to make it really compelling. I can't really get into the minutia of that because I'm not writing the character right now. I'm just kind of spitballing ideas. This is basically like, you know, asking me to tell a joke. You know, I'm struggling with the joke. But I'm giving you just kind of an over idea of what I would focus on with the character to try to differentiate him from Peter and make him a lot more interesting, in my opinion. So that's my thoughts on that. Well, if you like my comic book ideas, you like this video, don't forget, like, share, subscribe, the whole 9 yards. Thank you so much for watching. Also, don't forget, we do have comic book-oriented offerings of our own and my company, Grindstone Arts. We have a couple of mailing lists to get on. There's the St. Peregrine mailing list. Once we have that whole thing with the Saints book figured out, we're going to start coming out with this book. So if you want to get on that mailing list to get a free print, please do so. Also, if you want some free trading cards, head over to the Human Shield mailing list. That one is written by Michael Octavius, a friend of Xavier, the head of Reconstruction, and that is going to be a follow-up to Peregrine Wings of the Falcon. Also, for books that are currently funding, that we have my novella American Monsters, which is a prequel to the upcoming comic book Project Lazarus. And then on top of that, we also have the comic 3 Nights, 4 Days, Part 2. It's a horror comic about 3 crusaders coming back from the Second Crusade to find a village besieged by demons and a satanic horde. So if all of those sound cool, go throw money at them, throw your signature, the whole 9 yards. We appreciate all your support. We're going to continue working for you guys. And of course, I'm going to continue making videos. With all that said, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite Vanilla Gorilla. Thank you so much for watching, and have yourselves a great rest of your day.